The sound of snapping wood was not loud, but in the dead silence of the workshop, it sounded like a gunshot. Elias stared down at the neck of the violin. The piece of curly maple he had spent the last 3 days carving. It was ruined. A hairline fracture, born of haste and too much pressure from the chisel, ran jaggedly down the scroll. His hands shook, not from cold, but from a boiling mixture of rage and humiliation. He hurled the ruined wood across the room, where it clattered against a pile of discarded shavings. "Useless!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "It takes too long, everything takes too long." From the corner of the room, shadowed by the dim light of a tallow candle, there was no movement. Master Thorne did not look up. The old man sat hunched over his workbench, his large, calloused hands moving with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a glacier. He was polishing a piece of spruce no larger than a coin. He had been polishing that same piece for 4 days. The friction of his thumb against the wood was the only sound that dared to compete with the howling wind outside the stone cottage. Elias wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of sawdust. He was 20 years old, gifted, and starving. Not for food. Master Thorne's larder was always full of heavy bread and cheese, but starving for recognition. He wanted his name to be whispered in the grand halls of Vienna and Paris. He wanted to be the luthier who changed the world, and he wanted to do it while he was still young enough to enjoy it. But here he was, trapped in this snow-blinded village to a known world, apprenticed to a man who measured time not in hours, but in seasons. "You are forcing the grain," Thorne said. His voice was like grinding stones, rough, and he didn't stop polishing. "The wood speaks, Elias, you are shouting over it." "The wood is dead matter, old man," Elias snapped. Instantly regretting the disrespect but too proud to retract it, it obeys the hand of the master. "If I carve it, it should hold. If I bend it, it should curve. But this timber, it resists me. It resists because it remembers." Thorne murmured, finally setting down the small piece of spruce. He turned on his stool, his eyes pale and watery, yet piercing. This wood grew on the northern slope of the Black Mountains. It stood against blizzards for 80 years before it was felled. It lay drying in my grandfather's loft for another 40. It has known patience longer than your bloodline has existed. You cannot bully 80 years of winter into bending in a single afternoon. Elias paced the floor, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "I don't have 40 years, master. The Duke's competition is in 1 month. 1 month. The winner becomes the royal luthier. A lifetime of commissions, gold, a legacy. If I don't present an instrument, I remain nobody." Thorne sighed, a sound that seemed to deflate his entire frame. A violin made in a month is not a violin. It is a box with strings. It may make noise, but it will not sing. To make it sing, the wood must surrender its tension. It must be at peace with its new shape. Elias clenched his fists. He looked at the rows of unfinished instruments hanging from the rafters like sleeping bats. Thorne's masterpieces. They were perfect, exquisite, and they took him years to finish. Elias admired them. Yes, but he despised the inefficiency. He had read the new treatises from the industrial cities. There were methods, chemical varnishes that dried in hours, heating ovens that could age wood artificially, clamps that forced symmetry. "I will make the instrument," Elias declared, his chin lifted. "And I will do it my way. I will use the kiln in the cellar. I will use the spirit varnish, not the oil. I will show you that mastery does not require a lifetime of waiting." Thorne looked at him for a long moment, a sadness in his eyes that Elias mistook for defeat. "Do what you must," the old man whispered. "But do not ask the wood for forgiveness when it screams." The next 3 weeks were a blur of feverish manic energy. Elias moved his workbench into the cellar, closer to the iron stove. He stoked the fire until the air was dry and suffocating, creating an artificial summer to purge the moisture from the fresh timber he had selected. He didn't choose the 80-year-old spruce, it was too hard, too stubborn. He chose a younger, more pliable pine from the lower valleys. It was softer, easier to work, and the heat of the stove made it compliant. While Thorne continued his slow, meditative scraping upstairs, Elias worked like a man possessed. He didn't sleep, he drank strong coffee and ate standing up. He carved the front and back plates with aggressive strokes, trusting his eye rather than the calipers. He thinned the wood down to the very limit of stability to ensure a loud, bright sound. When it came time to bend the ribs, the sides of the violin, he didn't soak them and gently coax them over a bending iron for hours. He steamed them violently and clamped them into a steel mold he had forged himself. The wood groaned under the pressure. Let it groan, Elias thought. It will learn its shape. The varnish was the final triumph of his modern method. Thorne's oil varnish took months to cure, layer upon microscopic layer, requiring sunlight and patience. Elias mixed a potent concoction of shellac and alcohol, he brushed it on thick, it dried in minutes, leaving a high glass-like shine. It looked spectacular. It glittered like a ruby in the firelight. By the 28th day the violin was finished. Elias held it up to the lantern light. It was beautiful. The varnish was flawless. The curves aggressive and bold. It looked like a weapon of sound. He plucked the E string. A sharp, piercing note rang out, bouncing off the stone walls of the cellar. It was loud. It was powerful. He ran upstairs, bursting into the main workshop where Thorne was boiling glue. "It is done," Elias announced, breathless. He held the instrument out. "Look at it. Have you ever seen such a finish? And I did it in weeks, not years." Thorne wiped his hands on his apron and took the violin. He held it gently, as if it were a wounded bird. He turned it over, inspecting the grain, the varnish, the neck. He tapped the back plate and listened to the hollow thump. "It is bright," Thorne said quietly. "It shines very brightly. But does it work?" Elias challenged. "It is under great tension." Thorne observed, tracing the seam where the woods met the back. "You can feel the wood fighting the glue. It wants to return to the tree, Elias. You have imprisoned it, not liberated it." "It sounds magnificent," Elias insisted, snatching the violin back. "Tomorrow, I leave for the capital. When I win, when the Duke hands me the crest of the royal luthier, I will send for you. I will buy you a new workshop, I will show you that the world has moved on." Thorne turned back to his glue pot. "Safe travels, Elias. Watch the weather. The cold makes things brittle." Elias left the next morning before dawn. He wrapped the violin in layers of silk and velvet, placing it inside a sturdy leather case. The journey to the capital was treacherous, a carriage ride through the biting winds of the mountain pass. Elias clutched the case to his chest the entire way, his heart hammering a rhythm of anticipated victory. He imagined the applause. He imagined the look on the other luthiers' faces, old men with their ancient methods, when his modern violin outplayed them all. He arrived in the capital on the evening of the competition. The great hall was ablaze with chandeliers, thousands of candles reflecting off the gold leaf and marble. The air smelled of perfume, wax and money. Musicians, nobles, and craftsmen mingled in a sea of velvet and lace. Elias found his place at the contestants' table. There were 12 other violins presented. Most looked dull compared to his dark, matte finishes, modest curves. His instrument sat in its open case, gleaming under the candlelight, attracting the eyes of every passerby. "A striking piece," a nobleman remarked, leaning in. "The varnish is like glass." "It is the future," Elias said, beaming. The competition began. A maestro from the royal orchestra was tasked with playing each instrument behind a screen, so the judges, including the Duke, would judge only the sound, not the appearance. One by one, the violins were played. They were sweet, mellow, somber, good but quiet. Then it was Elias's turn. The maestro lifted Elias's violin, he played a scale. The sound tore through the hall. It was incredibly loud, brighter than anything that had before. It demanded attention. Elias saw the Duke sit up in his chair. He saw the judges nodding. It projected. It had power. The maestro began a complex concerto, a piece full of rapid arpeggios and double stops. Elias closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. "I did it," he thought, "I beat time." But as the maestro reached the crescendo, the high frantic climax of the piece, something changed in the tone. The brightness began to curdle. The notes grew harsh, nasal, almost metallic. And then, a sound that stopped the hearts of everyone in the room. Sirac, it wasn't a string snapping, it was deeper, hollower, it was the sound of a bone breaking. The music stopped abruptly. The maestro lowered the violin, looking at it with horror. He stepped out from behind the screen, holding the instrument up for the judges to see. The heat of the packed hall, the humidity of the breathing crowd, and the vibration of the music had been the final straw. The back plate, forced into a shape it did not want, had split down the center. The varnish, too hard and brittle to flex with the wood's vibration, had shattered like a spider web across the surface. The neck, glued with haste, had pulled forward, snapping the fingerboard away from the body. The violin hadn't just broken, it had exploded from the inside out, it had committed suicide. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a silence so profound it felt heavy. Elias stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. He felt the blood drain from his face. The future lay in ruins in the maestro's hands. Disqualified, the head judge muttered, waving a dismissive hand. Elias didn't hear the rest. He didn't hear the next contestant. He stumbled out of the great hall, leaving the shattered remains of his ambition behind. He walked out into the city streets, where the snow had begun to fall. He walked without a coat, without direction, the image of a split wood burning in his mind. He had tried to cheat the process. He had tried to sprint a marathon, and the wood, as Thorne had predicted, had screamed. He found himself under a bridge by the frozen river, shivering violently. He had no money for an inn. He had spent his last coin on the carriage. He was alone, humiliated and broken. He sat in the dirt, pulling his knees to his chest, wishing the cold would simply take him. "You built a house of cards in a hurricane," a voice said. Elias looked up, eyes blurry with cold tears. He expected a guard or a thief. But standing there, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, holding a lantern against the dark, was Master Thorne. Elias stared at the hand offered to him. It was gnarled, scarred by 1,000 slicks of the chisel, stained with walnut oil and resin. It was the hand of a man who had shaped forests into songs. Elias didn't deserve to touch it. "I failed," Elias croaked, his voice barely audible over it howling beneath the bridge. "It exploded, Master. It just shattered. The wood broke because it was screaming, and you refused to listen," Thorne said, his tone devoid of pity but heavy with truth. He didn't retract his hand. "Failure is not the falling down, Elias. Failure is staying in the mud when you have work to do. Stand up." Elias took the hand. Thorne's grip was iron. He pulled the young man to his feet, wrapping his own heavy cloak around Elias's shivering shoulders. They walked to the carriage Thorne had hired, a modest, slow thing, nothing like the racing coach Elias had taken to the city. The journey back to the village was long and silent. Thorne did not scold him. He did not mention the cost of the trip, nor the embarrassment of the public spectacle. He simply let the silence do the work. In that silence, Elias replayed the sound of the crack over and over again, a torturous loop that chipped away at his arrogance. When they returned to the stone cottage, the workshop was exactly as Elias had left it, save for one detail. The stove in the cellar had been extinguished. The artificial summer was over. The room was cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. "Do I pack?" Mize asked, standing awkwardly by the door. Thorne sat on his stool picking up a scraper. "That depends. Are you a luthier? Or are you a manufacturer?" Elias looked at his own hands. They were young, capable, but reckless. "I want to make music," he whispered. "I want to make something that lasts. Then you will start again," Thorne said, not looking up. "But this time you will not touch a chisel for a year." The punishment was severe, yet Elias accepted it with a strange sense of relief. For the first 6 months, he was allowed only to sharpen tools. He sat for hours at the grinding stone, water sloughing over the steel, moving the blades in slow, rhythmic circles until they could split a hair floating in the air. He learned that sharpness was not achieved by pressing hard against the stone, but by maintaining a consistent angle. Stroke after stroke, breath after breath. He learned to listen to the steel. A rasping sound meant the angle was wrong, a singing whisper meant it was true. For the next 6 months, his task was to organize the wood store. Thorne sent him into the loft where dusty planks of maple and spruce lay in piles. Elias had to sort them not by size, but by resonance. He had to tap each board with a felt mallet and listen to the pitch it returned. Some thudded dully, those were for firewood. Others rang like bells, those were for the masters. He learned that the ugliest, knottiest wood often held the deepest secrets, and that the straightest grain did not always promise the sweetest song. Seasons bled into one another. The snow melted. The wildflowers bloomed in the valley, the leaves turned to returned. Elias grew quiet. The frantic energy that had once made his knee bounce and his fingers drum ceased. He moved slower, but with greater purpose. When he walked across the floorboards, he didn't stump, he glided. One winter evening, 2 years after the disaster in the capital, Thorne called Elias to his bench. The old master was frail now. His breathing rattled in his chest like dry leaves, and his hands, once steady as stone, trembled with a palsy that he tried to hide. On the workbench lay the piece of spruce from the northern slope of the Black Mountains. The same piece Thorne had been polishing the night Elias had stormed out. It was no longer a rough block. It was carved into a front plate of breathtaking arching. It rose and fell like a breath. "My hands obey me no longer," Thorne said, his voice thin. He pushed the plate toward Elias. "I cannot finish the purfling. The channel must be cut. If I do it I will slip and 40 years of drying will be wasted." Elias looked at the wood. It was holy ground. "Master, I cannot. If I ruin this." "You ruined the last one because you wanted glory," Thorne said, his eyes locking onto Elias's. "You will finish this one because you love the wood. There is a difference. Take the knife." Elias took the purfling knife. The handle was worn from Thorne's grip. He looked at the delicate edge of the spruce. The channel for the inlay had to be cut with surgical precision. Too deep and the plate would crack, too shallow and the inlay would not hold. Elias closed his eyes. He breathed. He didn't think about the royal luthier. He didn't think about the duke or the applause. He thought about the tree standing on the mountain slope, enduring the blizzard. He felt the history in the grain. He began to cut. He moved with agonizing slowness. A single pass took minutes. He didn't force the blade, he let it find the path between the fibers. Hours passed. The candle burned low. Thorne watched, silent and unmoving. Elias entered a trance state where time dissolved. There was no hunger, no fatigue, only the connection between his hand, the steel and the spruce. When he finished the channel, sweat soaked his shirt, though the room was cold. He looked up. Thorne was smiling, a genuine, crinkled smile that lit up his gray face. "It fits," the old man whispered. "No, the varnish." The finishing of the Black Mountain violin took another year. Elias applied the oil varnish in microscopic layers. He waited for the sun. On cloudy days, he did nothing but watch the sky. Learning that waiting was part of the work. He rubbed the finish down with pumice and oil, then applied another layer. The wood began to glow from within, a deep, honey, amber fire that shifted as he turned it in the light. It wasn't the glassy, flashy shine of his failed competition piece. It was a soft, deep luster, like looking into a pool of ancient water. Finally, the instrument was strung. Thorne was bedridden by then. His workshop bed had been moved near the fire. He was fading, his body becoming as light and brittle as a dried leaf. "Play it," Thorne whispered, pointing a shaking finger at the violin. Elias lifted the instrument. It felt different than any he had ever held. It didn't feel like an object. It felt like a living limb. It had no tensions. He placed the bow on the string. He didn't play a concerto. He didn't play a scale. He played a single, long note on the G string. The sound that emerged was not loud. It didn't tear the air, it bloomed. It started as a whisper, rich and dark, and expanded until it filled every corner of the room. Vibrating through the floorboards, through the bed frame, through their very bones. It was a sound of immense sorrow and immense joy, wrapped together. It was the sound of the wind in the Black Mountains. It was the sound of 80 years of winter and 40 years of silence. Elias played a simple lullaby, a folk tune from the village. The violin sang with a human voice. It wept. Tears streamed down Thorne's face, disappearing into his beard. He closed his eyes, his breathing sensing with the rise and fall of the bow. "It is finished," Thorne breathed. "You listened." Thorne died 3 days later. He passed peacefully in his sleep, the smell of varnish and sawdust comforting him until the end. Elias buried him beneath the great oak tree behind the cottage. He did not leave for the capital. He did not enter the violin in any competition. He hung it on the wall, in the place of honor. Years turned into decades. The modern method, that Elias had once championed, swept through the world. Factories churned out thousands of violins a day, pressed in steam molds, sprayed with plastic lacquers, sold cheap to students and orchestras. They were loud, they were bright, and they broke after 10 years, their souls hollow. Elias remained in the stone cottage. His hair turned gray, then white. His hands grew gnarled and stained with walnut oil. People traveled from all over the continent to find the hermit of the valley. They came seeking instruments that possessed a soul. One afternoon, a young man arrived. He was dressed in fine city clothes, carrying a blueprint scroll and a look of impatient ambition in his eyes. "I need a violin," the young man said, tapping his foot. "I have an audition for the symphony in 3 weeks. I need your best work and I will pay double if you can rush the drying process." Elias looked at the boy. He saw the fire, the arrogance, the desperate need for validation. He saw himself 50 years ago. Elias picked up a rough block of maple. He set it on the workbench. He picked up a scraper and began to polish it, slowly, methodically. Scrape. Scrape, scrape. "I cannot help you," Elias said gently, his voice like grinding stones. "Why not have money?" the boy insisted. Elias stopped scraping and looked at the Black Mountain violin, hanging on the wall, its amber varnish glowing in the afternoon sun. It was silent, yet it sang a song of patience that only those who listened could hear. "Because my son," Elias said, looking back at the boy with kind, watery eyes. "You are asking the wood to run, when it has only just learned how to stand. A masterpiece is not made by the clock. It is made by the surrender of the self." He went back to polishing the small piece of wood. The friction of his thumb was the only sound in the room. The boy stood there confused, then frustrated, and finally intrigued. He didn't leave. He watched the old man work, and in the silence, the lesson began again. The world screams for us to hurry. It demands instant results, overnight successes, and shortcuts to glory. But the things that truly matter, mastery, love, character, and legacy, cannot be microwaved. They must be slow, cooked over the fires of patience and resilience. When you try to force your life into a shape it isn't ready for, you crack. But when you take the time to listen, to grow, and to respect the process, you create something that doesn't just make noise, but sings. If this story touched your heart, Subscribe to Daily Motivation Tales for more tales that feed the soul.